Lieutenant Kira of the Thalian Imperial Fleet woke to silence and agony. The battle was over. She knew that immediately from the absence of weapons fire and the eerie quiet blanketing the devastated landscape. Her squad had been ambushed during what should have been routine patrol of the border world Terminus 7. The humans had hit them with coordinated precision. Her commanders claimed the primitive species wasn't capable of executing. She'd watched her squadmates fall around her before shrapnel tore through her side and leg, sending her tumbling into a crater. She must have lost consciousness then. Now she lay among debris and bodies, Thalian and human both, unable to move without waves of agony radiating through her entire body. Her combat armor was cracked and useless, its medical systems offline. Her communication device was destroyed. Her weapon lay several meters away, completely out of reach given her condition. Kira tried to assess her injuries with clinical detachment. Deep lacerations across her torso, damaged left leg that wouldn't support any weight, probable internal bleeding based on the pain patterns, significant blood loss making everything hazy and weak. She was dying slowly. The Thalian Empire trained soldiers to face death with dignity and honor, but Kira found she was terrified anyway, not of death itself, but of dying alone on this desolate rock, abandoned by both sides, reduced to another casualty statistic in a war she'd never fully understood or believed in. Hours passed. The twin suns moved across the ash-gray sky. Kira drifted in and out of consciousness, her body's survival mechanisms shutting down non-essential functions to preserve whatever life remained. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching until they were very close. Her long ears, normally so sensitive to sound, barely registered the noise. She forced her eyes open and saw a figure approaching through the smoke and dust. Human, male, wearing damaged combat gear with clear medic insignia, carrying a field pack. Fear cut through her pain. Enemy combatant, here to finish what the battle started. She tried desperately to reach for the combat knife still attached to her belt, but her arm wouldn't respond properly. Her body was too damaged, too weak to mount even minimal defense. The human stopped several meters away, clearly seeing her defensive attempt. He raised both hands slowly, deliberately showing they were empty and unthreatening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said in accented but perfectly understandable Thalian. "I'm a medic. I'm searching for survivors to provide medical assistance. Any survivors, regardless of species or side. You're badly injured. Will you let me treat your wounds?" Kira stared at him, her brain struggling to process this through layers of pain and shock and ingrained training. Humans were the enemy. Humans had started this war through aggressive territorial expansion. Humans were ruthless, savage, incapable of honor or genuine compassion, according to every piece of imperial propaganda she'd been exposed to throughout her life. But this human was offering medical help, offering to save an enemy soldier's life. Why? She managed to force out through cracked, dry lips. Why help enemy? Because you're a person who's hurt and I'm a medic who can help. That's sufficient reason. He moved slightly closer, still slow and careful in his approach. "I can't promise I can save you. Your injuries are severe and I have very limited supplies, but I can try. Will you let me try?" Kira's military training screamed at her to refuse, to maintain hostility, to die with honor rather than accept assistance from the enemy who'd killed her squadmates. But a deeper survival instinct, something more fundamental than training or ideology, overrode everything else. She was dying. He was offering life. Species and sides suddenly seemed far less important than continuing to breathe. She nodded weakly, the movement sending fresh pain through her damaged body. The human approached carefully, kneeling beside her and quickly assessing her injuries with practiced efficiency that suggested extensive medical experience. "My name is James," he said while working, his hands gentle despite their obvious roughness and strength. "I'm going to stop the bleeding first, then stabilize you enough for transport to better shelter. This is going to hurt significantly. I'm genuinely sorry about that, but it's necessary. He was right. The pain was excruciating as he applied direct pressure to wounds and began emergency field treatment with his limited supplies. But his hands were remarkably skilled, and his voice remained calm and steady throughout, providing constant commentary about what he was doing and why, giving her something to focus on besides the agony. "Why are you alone?" Kira managed to ask when she could speak again. "Where is your unit?" "Dead or evacuated. I was separated during the fighting, found a cave system to shelter in until the battle moved on. When I emerged, both sides had withdrawn completely and left their casualties behind to die." His voice carried profound sadness. "I've been searching systematically for survivors. You're the third I've found. The other two were humans. I stabilized them and they were evacuated when a recovery transport came looking for wounded. I kept searching because dying alone in the field is terrible. Nobody deserves that fate. I am enemy. You should leave me to die. Take medical supplies, save them for your own people who deserve help." Kira didn't understand why she was arguing against her own survival, but training and ideology were deeply ingrained. "You're a wounded person who needs help. That's all that matters in this moment." He continued working on her injuries with focused determination. "I took an oath to preserve life when possible. That oath doesn't include a species clause or an enemy exemption." Kira couldn't comprehend him, couldn't understand this compassion for an enemy who would have killed him in battle without hesitation if their positions were reversed. Couldn't process why he was expending precious medical resources on her instead of saving them for fellow humans who shared his species and his side. But she was too weak to argue effectively, and too desperate for survival to reject the help being offered so freely. James worked for what felt like hours, stopping bleeding through pressure and field dressings, treating wounds with antiseptic, splinting her damaged leg, administering pain medication and antibiotics from his limited supplies. Throughout everything, he maintained that steady, calm voice, explaining what he was doing, asking about her pain levels, treating her like a valued patient rather than an enemy combatant. "I need to move you to better shelter," he finally said. "There's a cave system nearby where I've been staying. It's defensible and dry. You'll be safer there while I figure out how to contact Thalen forces for your evacuation. Can you tolerate being moved?" Kira nodded, beyond coherent speech now. The medication was helping, but the accumulated damage and blood loss had pushed her to the edge of consciousness. James carefully lifted her. She was taller than him by Thalen standards but slender, and he was clearly strong, and carried her across the devastated landscape toward rock formations visible in the distance. Kira lost consciousness again from the combination of pain and movement, waking later to find herself in a dim cave illuminated by small emergency lights. James was still there, carefully checking her bandages and adjusting her position to minimize ongoing pain. "Welcome back," he said with a small, genuine smile when he saw her eyes open. "You're stable for now. Not out of danger by any means, but stable enough that I think you'll survive if we can get you proper medical care soon. Rest now. I'll keep watch and work on contacting someone who can evacuate you properly." "Why?" Kira whispered again, the question still not adequately answered in her confused, pained mind. "Why save enemy?" "Because leaving you to die would make me the monster your propaganda probably says all humans are." He settled nearby with communication equipment. "And because maybe if we start genuinely seeing each other as people worth saving, this war becomes much harder to justify continuing. That's a long-term, idealistic hope. Short-term and practical, I'm helping you simply because it's the right thing to do, and I literally cannot live with myself if I don't at least try when I have the ability to help." Kira stared at him through her exhaustion and pain. This human who'd chosen compassion over convenience, mercy over military logic, saving lives over following orders. She didn't understand him, but she was profoundly grateful he existed. And somewhere in her pain-fogged mind, she recognized that something fundamental about her understanding of humans, and about war itself, had just been completely shattered by one medic's inexplicable kindness. Kira spent 2 days in that cave, while James tended her injuries with limited supplies, and attempted repeatedly to establish communication with rescue forces from either side. Her condition stabilized gradually. The immediate danger of bleeding out passed as his emergency treatment proved effective, though she remained desperately weak and unable to move more than minimally without assistance. James cared for her with professional competence mixed with unexpected gentleness. He shared his limited emergency rations without complaint, kept her warm with survival blankets, talked to her when she was conscious and lucid enough to hold conversation. "Tell me about yourself," he said during one such conversation while changing her bandages with careful precision. "Not military information. I'm not interrogating you for intelligence purposes. Just, who is Lieutenant Kira when she's not fighting a war she didn't choose?" Kira was uncertain about answering, but isolation and vulnerability had loosened her usual military caution, and talking was better than dwelling on pain and fear. "I was teacher before conscription, literature and history for younglings in primary education. I loved that work deeply." Her ears drooped with sadness at the memory. "War took me from classroom. I tell myself I can return to teaching after my service obligation ends, but that seems increasingly unlikely now." "A teacher, that somehow fits perfectly." James adjusted her bandages with practiced care. "You have that patient way of explaining things I associate with good educators. What did you teach your students about humans? I'm curious what Imperial curriculum says." "That humans are aggressive, expansionist, fundamentally dishonorable species that threatens Thaylen sovereignty through relentless territorial encroachment. That you lack the cultural sophistication and moral framework that characterizes truly civilized species. That the Empire must defend against human aggression to protect our way of life and values." She recited what she'd been required to teach, feeling strange dissonance saying it to the human who'd saved her life. "And now?" James asked quietly. "After I've spent 2 days keeping you alive when leaving you would have been safer and easier." Kira was silent for a long moment, her ears angling with profound confusion and uncertainty. "Now I do not know what to believe. You are either extraordinary exception that proves the general rule about human nature, or the propaganda is far more complicated and dishonest than I was led to believe. Both possibilities disturb me very deeply. Propaganda usually is more complicated and dishonest than presented, on both sides of any conflict." James offered her water carefully, supporting her head so she could drink. "I've been taught that Thaylen are rigid, cruel, incapable of adapting or showing genuine mercy to anyone outside your hierarchical structure. That your empire is fundamentally incompatible with human values and must be resisted at all costs. But you seem like a completely regular person who wanted to teach children about literature and got drafted into a war you didn't choose or particularly want to fight. That doesn't fit my propaganda framework either." So we both discover our supposed enemies are considerably more complex than we were systematically taught. Kira sipped the water gratefully, her throat painfully dry. "What does that realization mean for the war itself?" "I honestly have no idea. I'm a field medic, not a diplomat or strategist." James checked her injuries again with efficient thoroughness. "But maybe it means something significant that I'm helping you and you're allowing me to help you. Maybe small individual acts of compassion matter even when large-scale peace seems impossible. How's your pain level currently?" "Manageable with the medication you've provided. I should be dead several times over by now. Your treatment objectively saved my life." Her ears angled with complex emotions between gratitude and deep confusion. "I still do not understand why you expended so much effort and precious medical supplies on an enemy soldier. Tactically, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever." "Tactically, you're probably right. It makes no sense at all. Morally and ethically, it was the only choice I could possibly live with. He settled beside her against the cave wall. I keep thinking, what if our positions were reversed? What if I was the wounded one and you were the Thalen medic who found me? Would I want you to leave me to die simply because of species and military sides? Absolutely not. I desperately want help. The golden rule applies across species lines as far as I'm concerned. Your golden rule philosophy may get you killed eventually. Compassion for designated enemies is exploitable weakness in military conflict. That may be so, but cruelty toward helpless wounded enemies is something I genuinely cannot come back from psychologically. I'd rather risk being exploited than become someone who can casually ignore profound suffering just because it's technically the enemy's suffering. He paused thoughtfully. Besides, you're not really my enemy right now in any meaningful sense. You're my patient. That's a fundamentally different relationship category with different ethical obligations. Kira found his reasoning profoundly alien, but oddly compelling despite her training. Thalen military doctrine does not include patient as valid relationship category with enemy combatants. We are systematically taught that enemy remains enemy until war formally concludes or they surrender officially to become prisoners with defined status. Well, you're far too injured to pose any threat whatsoever, and I'm far too committed to keeping you alive to see you as an enemy in practical terms. So we're in undefined territory according to both our doctrines. James actually smiled slightly. Let's just say you're a person I'm helping, and I'm a person you're allowing to help you. We can worry about formal doctrinal categorization later, if we both survive long enough for it to matter. They fell into cautious but functional routine over the following days, James treating her injuries with his dwindling supplies, sharing rations that were clearly insufficient for 2 people, maintaining their cave shelter while continuing persistent attempts to establish communication with potential rescue forces. Kira watched him work with growing fascination, noting his careful competence, his genuine concern for her well-being that went far beyond minimal obligation, his fundamental decency that contradicted absolutely everything she'd been systematically taught about human nature. "I need to know something," she said on the 3rd day while he was cleaning her wounds again with gentle precision. "When you first found me lying there, you could have simply taken my remaining equipment and left me to die. No one would ever have known. It would have been completely tactically sound choice. Why didn't you?" "Because I would have known. And I would have had to live with that choice for the rest of my life, however long or short that might be." James didn't look up from his careful work. "I can't control the war or the politics or what our respective governments decide, but I can absolutely control whether I'm someone who leaves wounded people to die when I have the ability to help them. I choose to be someone who helps. That's a choice I have to consciously make every single day in every situation, not just when it's convenient or completely safe." That philosophy is remarkably idealistic, wildly impractical, potentially fatal weakness in military context. But Kira's ears angled with something very much like respect, also remarkably brave in its own way. I think the bravery required to maintain compassion despite war's brutality is different than courage in direct combat, but genuine bravery nonetheless. "Thank you, I think." He finally looked up and smiled slightly. "Your ears do that particular angle thing when you're feeling something intensely. I've been learning to read them over these days. Is that invasive of your privacy?" "I'm not trying to invade anything. I just want to understand how you're feeling so I can provide better care." "It is surprisingly thoughtful that you observe carefully enough to learn Thalen body language cues. Most humans in my limited experience do not bother with such cultural details." Kira's ears communicated a complex mixture of vulnerability and cautious developing trust. "You may continue reading my ears without objection. I find I do not mind you understanding my emotional state. It seems appropriate given that you have seen me at my absolute most vulnerable physically. Then I'll tell you honestly. Your ears are currently communicating that you're uncertain but no longer actively hostile, vulnerable but not afraid of me specifically, confused about many things but processing new information with genuine openness. Am I reading that correctly? Disturbingly accurately, yes. A pause while she processed this. What are you feeling, James? You do not have expressive ears that broadcast emotions so clearly to observers. Worried about your recovery and whether my limited treatment is actually sufficient. Frustrated that I cannot get communication equipment working properly to arrange your evacuation. Exhausted from maintaining constant watch. Oddly peaceful despite our impossible circumstances. And profoundly grateful you're alive and talking instead of dying in that crater where I found you. He met her eyes directly. I'm feeling like maybe preserving one single life matters even in the middle of a massive war that's destroying thousands. That's probably naive and idealistic, but it's genuinely what I feel right now. Kira's ears angled with an emotion she didn't have adequate words for. Something between gratitude and grief and fragile hope, that compassion could exist even in war's darkest places. On the fourth day, James finally managed to establish brief communication with what turned out to be Thaylan military frequencies. I have a severely wounded Thaylan soldier requiring urgent medical evacuation. He transmitted carefully in his accented Thaylan. Transmitting current coordinates. She's stable but desperately needs proper medical facilities beyond my field capabilities. I'm a human medic providing emergency care. The response came quickly, sharp with suspicion. Confirm, human is holding Thaylan prisoner. Negative, I'm providing voluntary medical assistance to a wounded soldier I found abandoned after the battle. Directly, confirm you're actually alive, and I'm genuinely helping rather than holding you. Kira nodded weakly. James helped her move closer to the communication device, supporting her carefully. This is Lieutenant Kira. Service number 7743 Delta Epsilon. I am severely wounded but alive. The human medic is providing life-saving care without any coercion. I request evacuation when tactically feasible. Another pause that stretched painfully. Then, confirmed, Lieutenant. Evacuation transport is being dispatched to your location. Estimated arrival 43 minutes. Can you reach designated extraction coordinates? James checked the coordinates they were transmitting. That's approximately 2 kilometers from our current position, much too far for her to travel safely with her injuries. He keyed the transmitter again. She cannot travel that distance in her condition. Can the transport adjust to these coordinates instead? Negative. Designated area is secured for safe landing. You must transport the wounded soldier to evacuation point. James looked at Kira, then back at the communicator with clear frustration. Understood, we'll be there, out. He immediately started gathering supplies and preparing to move her again. I can carry you most of the way, but it's going to be extremely rough with this terrain. Are you ready? You are planning to bring me to the evacuation point yourself. You will be completely exposed to Thaylan military forces. They may capture or kill you. Kira's ears angled with genuine alarm. You should simply provide directions and let me attempt to travel alone. You absolutely cannot travel alone with those injuries. You'd die before reaching the coordinates. And I'm not going to get you this far just to have you die from complications during transport. James was already preparing a makeshift stretcher from materials in the cave. I'll get you to the evacuation point, ensure they actually take you properly, then withdraw before they can decide whether to shoot me or capture me for interrogation. It's risky but manageable. Why risk yourself further? You have already done far more than any obligation would require. Your duty ends here safely. My obligation ends when I know with certainty you're safely evacuated and receiving proper professional medical care. Not one moment before. He helped her onto the stretcher with careful gentleness despite his obvious urgency. Besides, I want to personally ensure they actually help you instead of leaving you somewhere out of tactical calculations. Call it insurance on my investment of effort. The journey was absolutely grueling. James carried her across rough, unstable terrain, moving as carefully as possible to minimize jostling but still maintaining reasonable pace to meet the deadline. Kira drifted in and out of consciousness from accumulated pain and exhaustion, but when she was lucid, she watched his face, covered in sweat, set with determined concentration, focused entirely on getting her to safety despite the considerable danger he was deliberately placing himself in. They reached the designated coordinates with approximately 5 minutes remaining before the estimated transport arrival. James set her down carefully in the clearing and checked her vital signs one final time with practiced efficiency. Evacuation transport inbound. You're going to make it, Kira, you survived. James, she caught his hand with surprising strength given her condition. Thank you for absolutely everything. For seeing me as person worth saving rather than enemy worth abandoning. For maintaining your compassion despite war and sides and propaganda. For proving humans are not what I was systematically taught to believe. Thank you for letting me help you. For trusting me enough to accept aid from someone who should have been your enemy. For showing me that Thalen are not what I was taught either, just regular people trying to survive impossible situations. He squeezed her hand gently. Recover well, survive this war somehow, maybe even go back to teaching literature to younglings someday. Maybe we both survive long enough to see actual peace. Her ears angled with desperate, fragile hope. Maybe compassion like yours spreads beyond isolated individuals to something larger and more systemic. The transport arrived with impressive precision. Large armored vehicle that landed heavily, creating dust clouds. Armed Thalen soldiers emerged immediately, weapons ready, taking defensive positions with professional efficiency. A Thalen officer approached cautiously, clearly seeing James kneeling beside Kira. Step away from the soldier, human. She needs immediate professional medical attention. I've stabilized her with field treatment, but she requires full hospital care urgently. James moved back slowly with hands clearly visible. I kept her alive for 4 days. Please ensure that actually matters. The officer signaled medical personnel forward. They rushed to Kira, beginning immediate assessment and transfer procedures to move her to the transport. Kira tried to speak, but her voice was too weak to carry across the distance. James met her eyes one final time across the growing space between them. Her ears angled with profound gratitude and something deeper, recognition that something genuinely significant had changed between them despite the ongoing war, that compassion had created connections stronger than military divisions. Why did you help her? The Thalen officer demanded, weapon still trained on James. Explain this action. Because she needed help and I could provide it. It's genuinely not more complicated than that simple fact. James was backing away slowly toward cover in the rock formations. You are enemy combatant who provided aid to Thalen soldier. This is completely unprecedented in my experience. Maybe precedents need to start somewhere. Maybe small acts of mercy matter. James reached partial cover. She's a fundamentally good person who wanted to teach children literature before war conscripted her. She deserves to live. That's literally all that matters to me. The officer watched him withdraw, weapons tracking his movement but notably not firing. You could be captured, interrogated for intelligence. You could certainly try. But I'd much rather you focus your energy and resources on getting Lieutenant Kira proper medical care, instead of wasting time chasing one medic through hostile terrain. James disappeared into the rock formations. The Thalen officer did not order immediate pursuit. Instead, he returned to the transport where Kira was being carefully loaded. That human saved your life, Lieutenant. Against all tactical sense and directly contrary to everything we teach about enemy nature. Yes, sir, against every logical calculation and expectation. her ears angled with profoundly complex emotions. He proved that compassion can transcend species and sides when someone is genuinely brave enough to act on it despite costs and risks. That lesson matters more than any tactical intelligence. 6 months later, Kira stood nervously at a preliminary diplomatic conference, one of the early peace talks that had begun as both species recognized the war's ultimate futility and unsustainable cost. She'd recovered from her injuries, though she carried visible scars and a slight permanent limp. But she was also carrying something far more important: direct testimony about human compassion that fundamentally contradicted decades of carefully crafted imperial propaganda. She was speaking to a mixed audience of Thaylen and human delegates about her experience being rescued, about James choosing to help despite every rational reason not to, about mercy existing even in the absolute midst of brutal military conflict. The Thaylen delegation listened with varying degrees of skepticism and grudging interest. Some clearly thought she was naive or had been manipulated. Others seemed genuinely moved by her testimony. Then she saw him, James, wearing civilian clothes now, apparently serving as part of a humanitarian organization that advocated for prisoner exchanges and medical neutrality in ongoing conflicts. Their eyes met across the conference hall. His face showed immediate recognition and genuine happiness. After her formal presentation concluded, they managed to speak privately in a quiet corridor. "You survived," James said with obvious profound relief. "I hoped desperately you would, but I never knew for certain what happened after the evacuation. You look, well, truly recovered. Thanks entirely to you. The military medical personnel said another few hours without your treatment would have been absolutely fatal." Her ears angled with deep gratitude. "I never properly thanked you adequately. You saved my life at tremendous personal risk. You thanked me plenty while I was treating you in that cave. And you're repaying that kindness by advocating publicly for more humane conduct during conflicts. That's significantly better than simple thanks." He smiled warmly. "I'm genuinely glad you made it. Glad you recovered enough to return to something resembling normal life. Normal life is considerably more complicated now. I cannot return to teaching knowing what I know about humans. That propaganda consists of systematic lies, that profound compassion exists across species lines, that mercy is genuinely possible even during war's worst moments." Her ears communicated frustration mixed with determination. "I testified here today specifically because your actions changed me fundamentally at the deepest level. I want others to know that humans are capable of extraordinary compassion. And I want people to know that Thaylen are regular people who want to live peacefully and teach children, and not be defined solely by military conflict." James paused thoughtfully. "We're both inconvenient truths for our respective propaganda machines now. Yes, profoundly inconvenient, but absolutely necessary truths if peace is ever to become real and lasting rather than just temporary ceasefire." Kira hesitated, then asked what she'd been wondering. "Do you regret helping me? Has there been significant consequence for your choice?" "Some consequences, yes. I was questioned extremely extensively about why I helped an enemy combatant when I should have focused exclusively on human casualties. Some people accused me of treason or inappropriate collaboration with the enemy, but I was also honored by humanitarian organizations for upholding medical ethics under extreme conditions." He shrugged. "Mixed consequences overall, but I absolutely don't regret the choice regardless of any consequences. I genuinely couldn't live with myself if I'd left you to die. That integrity is remarkably rare and profoundly valuable. Thank you for maintaining it despite personal cost. Thank you for surviving and using that survival to advocate for meaningful change. That gives deep meaning to everything we both went through in that cave." James smiled. "You're making a real difference here." They talked for considerably longer, about their respective experiences since the battle, about the slow peace process, about hopes for a future where species differences didn't automatically create enemies, about the small ways individual compassion could influence larger political structures. Finally, Kira said what she'd been wanting to express since first seeing him. You proved definitively to me that compassion is not weakness and mercy is not betrayal. You taught me to see designated enemy as person first and soldier second. That fundamental lesson has completely reshaped everything I believe about the universe and my place in it. And you taught me that risking compassion is genuinely worthwhile, that some Thalen are deeply decent people who deserve help regardless of military sides, that small acts of mercy matter profoundly, even when large-scale peace seems completely impossible. James took her hand briefly. We both learned something critically important, maybe that matters in ways we can't fully measure. It matters to me, profoundly and permanently. Her ears angled with deep emotion. You came to my rescue when I was wounded and completely alone. You saved my life when leaving me would have been objectively easier and infinitely safer. I will never forget that compassion or the remarkable human who demonstrated it. And I'll never forget the Thalen who trusted me enough to accept help from an enemy, who survived against impossible odds, who used that survival to advocate for better mutual understanding between our peoples. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. Survive this peace process too, Kira. Keep teaching people that enemies are often just people who haven't properly met yet. You also survive and continue being compassionate despite how difficult that choice is. The galaxy desperately needs more medics like you who see suffering people instead of military sides. Years passed gradually. The war wound down through exhausting negotiated settlements and painful compromises. Kira and James remained in occasional contact, first through formal diplomatic channels, later through genuine developing friendship that transcended their initial circumstances. They became unlikely but effective advocates for lasting peace, speaking together at conferences about how compassion demonstrated in conflict's midst had fundamentally changed both their perspectives and assumptions. I was left wounded and alone after battle, Kira would tell audiences. Abandoned by both sides, dying slowly with absolutely no hope of rescue or survival. Then a human came, not to finish me as enemy propaganda said humans would, but to save me despite every reason not to. That single act of mercy reshaped everything I believed about his entire species. I found a wounded Thalen soldier in a crater, James would add. My enemy by every official designation and military doctrine, but also clearly a suffering person who I could help with my medical skills. That choice, to see her as person rather than enemy, saved both our lives in profoundly different but equally important ways. Together they proved that compassion could bridge seemingly unbridgeable species divides, that mercy existed even in war's darkest moments, that sometimes being rescued meant far more than just physical survival. It meant having your fundamental assumptions about the universe completely reshaped by someone who chose kindness over cruelty when either choice would have been defensible. Kira had been left wounded and alone until a human came to her rescue. That rescue saved her life and changed her entire world. And in allowing herself to be rescued, in trusting an enemy enough to accept help, she had changed him too, proving that compassion given becomes compassion received, that mercy creates connections stronger than war's artificial divisions, that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to help someone who has every logical reason to be your enemy, but who you choose to see as simply a person desperately in need.